Good morning, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer, and I hope you're doing very well today. Welcome to another MH2 spoiler video. This one is for a very strong white hate bear called Sanctifier en-Vec. Now, I think this card absolutely will see a ton of modern play. We should get that out of the way first. And I don't think it is only a meta call, although its presence will wax and wane based on the meta. I think this will always be in sideboards for the foreseeable future to at least some degree. But more specifically, we're going to talk about, is it dead? Is it a good fit in the burgeoning Deadguy Ale Orzhov shell that's getting just new tech left, right, and center from the set? I'm going to say yes, and I'm also going to say that no, it's not a very good fit in Abzan midrange, or maybe even in Mardu midrange. In the three-color decks, I'm a lot less high on it. So we're going to talk all about it. Thank you very much for watching. Let's break down Sanctifier en-Vec. So the first thing I want to say about this card is that I have always loved the naming conventions of en-Vec and ill-Vec, and for those who don't know, lore-wise, the Vec were a human tribe, possibly from Dominaria, who were trapped on the Plane of Wrath by the will of Volrath. They were divided into two groups, the en-Vec, who remained independent, and the ill-Vec, who defected to Volrath's service. Very cool stuff. I've always just, as a child, that en-Vec, ill-Vec stuff captured my imagination, even though I didn't know what it was about. So Sanctifier en-Vec is a 2/2 for 2. Double white casting cost, human cleric. So the classic hate bear style stat line relative to mana cost. Her text box begins with a very strong line that says protection from black and from red. Oh my goodness, that is one powerful pair of colors to have total protection from, the two most premier removal colors in the entire modern format. It goes on. When Sanctifier en-Vec enters the battlefield, exile all cards that are black or red from all graveyards. So this is basically an RIP ETB triggered ability that specifically hoses black or red cards. Now, if a black or red permanent spell or card not on the battlefield would be put into a graveyard, exile it instead. Now, I don't exactly know what that templating means. That's a little bit new to me, but it seems like they are going out of their way to make sure that just about everything that could go into the graveyard from those two colors will instead be exiled. So what we have here, my friends, is some kind of an apocalyptically powerful hybrid of Auric Champion minus the life gain and Rest in Peace minus the enchantment type that also has a bigger stat line than Auric Champion. I really want you to realize, before we talk about specific use cases and everything else, just how powerful this is in a vacuum overall. Again, we've got a 2/2 for 2, which is the normal bear stat line, decent. It's pro-black. That's really good. It's pro-red. That's really good. It's got an ETB exiling all black and red cards from all graveyards, and it's got a replacement effect preventing other black or red permanent spells or cards not on the battlefield from entering the graveyard after the fact. This is a graveyard hoser, and it is a very, very strong color hoser beyond that. So the first and most obvious victim of the Sanctifier is Dredge. Obviously, Dredge is a base black and red deck. Obviously, the vast majority of cards that they play, especially ones that they can actually win the game with, are black and red, and certainly most of the cards that go into the graveyard. Also, Lightning Axe and Nature's Claim, all of these cards that are designed to hit problematic creatures or problematic non-creature permanents, they either whiff on Sanctifier because she's not an enchantment or an artifact, or they whiff on her because the spells are black or red. Now Dredge does play sometimes a one of Blast Zone. Without totally restructuring their deck, that's probably the best chance they have at removing her, and even if they're able to do that, she will have done so much damage by then. She will have compelled Dredge to play a game they don't want to play, taking up a Blast Zone, activating a Blast Zone, wasting at least 2 turns. Sanctifier will have connected once or twice by then, and she will have, of course, ETB'd and exiled everything that matters anyway. So very, very strong card, to the point where Dredge probably can't really beat it a vast majority of the time without maybe like putting Path to Exile in their sideboard. Now, a lot of the Dredge decks have picked up that the new Cathartic Reunion, the red-white card, so white is in the deck, but Path to Exile is not a great card for Dredge outside of specifically having to deal with this card. So really, really tough one for Dredge to see. We also have the Burgeoning Reanimator strategy, which is basically being assembled almost from the ground up in MH2. Unmarked Grave here represents that, and obviously Sanctifier is going to hose that deck really hard too. You're going to get rid of any targets they might have already put in the bin with Unmarked Grave. It comes down early enough to be quicker or as quick as the Reanimator deck, and of course they will struggle to remove her much of the time, basically rendering their strategy obsolete. Now, Prowess decks are not necessarily black most of the time. We are seeing Izzet Prowess in the pre-Modern Horizons 2 meta be the strongest deck. There's also Boros Prowess, Mono Red. You know what? It really doesn't matter what variant it is. Obviously, if people are still playing Rakdos Prowess, Sanctifier would hose that the absolute hardest, right? But this is still extraordinarily good against any red Prowess variant because you have a 2/2 for 2, which is not a bad rate if you're trying to disrupt while racing, and you're pro-red. You're pro-red, so you are blocking infinitely, basically, against their ground troops, and upon ETB, and while she sticks around, for as long as she sticks around, Lava Dart is a very bad card. Firebolt is hosed, and if the Prowess deck is on Bedlam Reveler is likely to be stuck in hand for the entire game, and I love Prowess, and it pains me a little bit to say that. It pains me even more to say this. This is just another white card from MH2, my friends, that is going to style all over Death Shadow decks as we know them. Now, Shadow has been through the ringer. It's been through so many different iterations. I am confident that a new form of Shadow will find a way to keep competing in the meta. But the currently popular Jund Shadow Lurrus builds as they stand, they are absolutely frightened of Sanctifier en-Vec. There is absolutely no question about that. Pro-black, pro-red, that's bad enough. Exiling the graveyard of all black and red cards is also quite bad for them because they get a lot of direct value out of Lurrus and incidental value out of other cards. Maybe Croaks is involved, maybe they're just growing their Tarmogoyfs, whatever the case may be. So the Jund Shadow deck is not totally cold in the water like Rakdos might be, because it does still have Hex Drinker and Tarmogoyf, but believe me, this is going to be a major player against those decks as well. And speaking of Tarmogoyf, Sanctifier en-Vec is actually pretty good against classic Jund as well. Once again, that ETB and that replacement effect are going to shrink Goyf. And increasingly these days, Jund is a green splash deck. At least before MH2 kicks in, it remains a green splash deck. It is base black-red. And therefore, of course, this 2/2 protection from most things, protection from all removal that Jund is likely to run, and the green threat like Tarmogoyf is also a little bit crippled by her graveyard hate, so a big problem. At least classic Jund, though, does have the option of killing the other white cards and then edicting her away with Liliana and resuming business as usual. Nevertheless, I would bring this card in against Jund for sure, assuming I had worse cards to bring out. Now, while we're talking about Tarmogoyf, maybe this is a good time to explain why I do not think Sanctifier en-Vec will junk. I think she is going to be very good in Deadguy Ale, but I don't think she's going to be as good in Abzan midrange. Why? Well, for one thing, it is a little bit harder to accommodate that double white on turn 2, especially if you're trying to be painless, and against black-red decks, you definitely want to be painless. In a 3-color deck than it is in a 2-color deck, so it's a cleaner fit in Deadguy. And also, perhaps more importantly, this is a symmetrical effect. So if you are playing Tarmogoyfs yourself, and or if you're playing some graveyard effects yourself beyond just the passive ways to grow Tarmogoyf, which Abzan is more likely to do in my experience than Deadguy, then your own Tarmogoyfs will be crippled by this hate bear. That's not really what we need. That's why Abzan midrange doesn't play Rest in Peace almost ever, for example. We'd rather play Nihil Spellbomb, which is asymmetrical and actually helps grow the Tarmogoyf a lot of the time. And we're already starting to question very, very strongly whether there's even an incentive to play green in the first place in your Deadguy Ale deck, because they're getting so much technology and none of it really directly synergizes with green. A lot of it actually seems to compel you to stay in two colors. And this is just another one of those guys where it's like, okay, if we're making our Tarmogoyfs worse, why would we even play green? Why don't we just stick with Deadguy? So my thoughts on this, given the power level of the card, given all the use cases I just mentioned, and giving the slight non-bow with our own green stuff, I think this card is absolutely dead, and I don't think it will junk. Now, before we move on from all the other use cases, I'll just use Ruin Crab as a stand-in for Mill, which in turn is a stand-in for all the decks that are not as directly and obviously hosed by Sanctifier as all the ones I just mentioned, but she still could be very, very good against them. So Mill, for example, is a blue-black deck, right? So you are hosing half of their deck that targets you, and maybe I should say that a different way. You're hosing half of their deck, but you're hosing basically all of their removal spells, so Sanctifier is going to be really tough for them to get rid of, right? And on top of that, against lots of decks in the format, if you are a mid-range deck, you're going to have some bad cards game one, whatever they might be. So Sanctifier en-Vec, even if she's not necessarily game-winning in an overt sense, she's proactive, she's a 2-2 for 2, she's going to hose one of their two colors. This example, I hope with Mill, illustrates that pretty well. Probably better than something in your main deck. She's probably good enough to bring in. And then, most decks these days, Mill most certainly included, use their graveyard to some degree for some amount of value. And you can even get a little bit of value out of that, whether it be making their Visions of Beyond worse, turning off their ability to do Snapcaster Mage, or whatever the non-creature spell Snapcaster Mage is, I can't remember at the moment. You guys get it, there's definitely, it makes their Crypt Incursion worse. There's a lot of little ways in which this very high floor of a card with relevant protection colors and a decent stat line can make the little percentage points on top of that go your way against graveyard-based strategies, even if they're not all in on graveyards. I think Mill is a good example of that, but there are dozens of decks in Modern to whom that applies as well. So we have to compare, obviously, Sanctifier en-Vec to Auric Champion. These are two premier 2-drop double white hate bears. They even have the same protection from the same colors. Now, who's better? Well, different roles slightly, but there's actually more overlap than you might think. Auric Champion's life gain is very, very, very good in a lot of matchups, but ultimately, in my experience, it is a little bit secondary, especially in mid-range decks that don't quite go as wide ourselves as maybe a lot of the decks that we're playing against, or maybe compared to like a Humans deck, for example. So the life gain's very good, don't get me wrong, but the protection effects are first and foremost. So if you call that a wash, obviously they have the same protection effects, the same casting cost. You're looking at a 1-1 that provides repeated life gain, which again is very good, versus a 2-2 that provides a very powerful ETB and static graveyard hate effect. I think there's room for both, and honestly, this is maybe a hot take, maybe I'll live to eat these words, but if I had to say which one is more powerful overall, just looking at them right now without having played Sanctifier, I'm going to go with Sanctifier, and I'm one of the biggest Auric Champion stands around. Now that said, if you are in Deadguy Ale, or if you're in like a Death and Taxes deck or a Humans deck, because this is a human, by the way, you can play both. You can definitely play both. Now you run the risk, of course, of having too much for one side of the meta, not enough for other things. Obviously, something has to give way if you're playing both of these cards, right? But it doesn't mean you need full playsets of both. Maybe you like 2 of each or something like that. I could absolutely see that being the case. One big advantage, besides just generically a 2-2 being more useful and resilient than a 1-1, but a big way in which that manifests, my friends, is against Plague Engineer. I can tell you firsthand from being on both sides of the table with regard to these cards that Plague Engineer is one of your very best outs to Auric Champion. Makes her an active liability, rather than otherwise a card that you might really struggle to beat. So Plague Man, obviously, going to see some amount of play in Modern going forward. I don't know whether he'll see more or less than he does right now. After MH2 is fully spoiled, that remains to be seen. But Sanctifier en-Vec surviving Plague Engineer is just another point in her favor. So just a few more miscellaneous points to round out this video, my friends. Sanctifier does require double white on turn 2, which means you want 20 white sources in your deck, and that can be a problem. It can be difficult to accommodate that, but personally, I'm already trying to accommodate Auric Champion in these types of lists most of the time. It's not that big of a leap to do that in general, especially if, like me, you're conceiving of these Deadguy lists as kind of being off of Field of Ruin. I already really want consistent mana for the Evoke cycle and for the Auric champions and other things like that. And of course, Turok, if he's involved, requires triple black, Liliana, double black on turn 3. So Bright Climb and Grim Climb Pathway are going to be very good lands, I think, in this shell, especially if we are looking for Sanctifier. Now, another miscellaneous point that's kind of funny, Lingering Souls, I think, is mostly being pushed out of decks like this, sorry Fjord, but it is definitely still a card that we could play. It remains to be seen whether we have room for it, but it's definitely a card that we could still play, and if we do, this is kind of funny and really decent synergy, because Lingering Souls is not a black card. Sanctifier is exiling all black or red cards from graveyard, but good old Lingering Souls is going to survive to utilize the graveyard, a little insult to injury in a fair match, that is for sure. The other thing to mention is if we are on Solitude in Grief, we do want as many hybrid Orzhov cards as possible, and one downfall perhaps of Sanctifier is that she is mono white, so in a deck that is still probably going to be base black, still looking disproportionately for black cards, not only to have the normal interactive curve outs early game, but also to enable 4 copies of Grief. Playing both Sanctifier and Auric Champion is definitely not a free roll in that regard. I submit Kaya Orzhov Usurper, Kaya's Guile, cards like this, if it's otherwise pretty equal, might be a little more desirable than monocolored cards just because they can pitch to either member of the Evoke Elemental Incarnation cycle. But back to some positives, Sword of Fire and Ice. Obviously, we're talking about Stoneforge Mystic lists when we're talking about Deadguy Ale these days, and Sanctifier picking up a sword, a very honorable, very noble sight, and having the hate on legs that can pick up a piece of equipment and start ending the game. I can't say it enough. It's really, really important for this archetype. One downfall, I suppose, is that this is just yet another card that gets wrecked by Kozilek's Return, and that card will be in the meta for the foreseeable future. So it would be nice in a way if this was like a 1-3, right? I don't know if it would be better overall, but it would be definitely nice in at least this way. But maybe with Deadguy Ale, we just have to accept that this card in particular kind of beats the pants off of us a lot of the time. And the final thing that I'll say here, my friends, is, like I said before, we're not only going to see this as a Deadguy Ale card, not even close. In fact, it's probably a little bit better in colors that might not already have the wealth of options that we have for hate bears or for graveyard hate or both. So if you think of like mono white taxes or something like that, or even the burgeoning Boros taxes shell, which I expect to be really powerful on the back of Imperial Recruiter. The point here is that she is good to see play in so many different shells. Gotta be prepared to beat her if you are on a black-red X mid-range deck or shadow deck or prowess deck or anything of the kind. So that is my rundown of Sanctifier en-Vec. I think she is very, very strong. I am kind of surprised they printed such an obviously pushed hate bear, but we'll see exactly how she plays. At the end of the day, she is only a 2/2 for 2. Maybe that gates the super high ceiling of the card to some degree, even though it also provides a pretty nice floor. I'm a big fan. I'm ready to register her in Deadguy Ale, that is for sure. So let me know what you think below. Thank you very much for watching, and there's more spoilers to go. I will see you for those.